Today we're covering the most evil doctors jailed for life for murder. They wore white coats, carried medical degrees, and claimed the noble title of doctor. But behind that title, some wielded scalpels and syringes not to heal, but to destroy. Let's start with the Angel of Death. Harold Shipman, the Angel of Death. In the quiet town of Hyde, England, patients trusted him completely. Harold Shipman, a general practitioner, always polite, always reassuring, always the picture of a respectable doctor. For over 2 decades, he built a reputation as a caring family physician. But beneath that mask of professionalism lurked a predator. Shipman wasn't saving lives. He was ending them. And he was doing it with the calm precision of a man who knew no one suspected him. It began with the quiet visits. The doctor would arrive at an elderly woman's home, armed with a syringe and the authority of his white coat. He would speak softly, offer comfort, and then, with one swift injection, administer a lethal dose of diamorphine. The patient would slip into what seemed like a peaceful death. Family members were left stunned, but they trusted the word of Dr. Shipman. He would sign the death certificate himself, citing natural causes, old age, or illness. Who would question the judgment of the doctor they had known for years? Again and again, the pattern repeated. Victims ranging from their late 50s to their 80s, women and men alike, healthy one moment, gone the next. To the outside world, Shipman was a pillar of the community, but in reality, he was methodically killing as many as 250 people over 2 decades. He didn't seek chaos or attention. He didn't chase headlines. He wanted control, the ultimate control, the power to decide who lived and who died. The facade began to crack in 1998. Kathleen Grundy, an active 81-year-old, died suddenly under Shipman's care. Unlike many of his victims, Kathleen wasn't frail or declining. She was vibrant, wealthy, and suspiciously, her will had been changed. In it, she left nearly her entire estate to one man, Dr. Harold Shipman. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, a solicitor, saw the forgery instantly. She alerted the authorities. Grundy's body was exhumed. The toxicology report revealed the truth. Massive, lethal levels of morphine coursing through her body, administered hours before her death. Shipman's scheme was unraveling. Police raided his home. What they found was damning: forged documents, falsified medical records, and a stash of jewelry belonging to his dead patients. His arrogance had finally betrayed him. The trial in 2000 exposed the monster behind the mask. Families sat in stunned silence as prosecutors described how Shipman altered patient records, pressured loved ones to cremate bodies, and systematically killed those who trusted him most. 15 murders were proven in court, but the inquiry would later conclude the number was likely closer to 250. The scale was incomprehensible. One man, a single doctor, had murdered more people than most serial killers in history combined. The jury deliberated less than a week. Guilty on all counts. The judge delivered a whole life order. Harold Shipman would die behind bars. And yet, in 2004, Shipman escaped accountability one final time. On the eve of his 58th birthday, he hanged himself in his prison cell. For the families, there would be no further answers, no apology, just the enduring horror that the man they trusted with their health had used that trust to kill. Harold Shipman was not just a doctor. He was the embodiment of betrayal, the smiling executioner, the man who weaponized medicine itself. His legacy is one of shattered trust, a reminder that even the safest spaces can harbor the darkest evil. Michael Swango, Doctor of Death. Across the Atlantic, another doctor was weaving his own web of death. Michael Swango, clean-cut, intelligent, a man who graduated near the top of his medical school class. To hospitals, he was a rising star. To his patients and colleagues, he was poison, literally. It started in the early 1980s at Southern Illinois University. Patients under his watch began dying unexpectedly. He seemed fascinated, almost thrilled, when emergencies erupted. Other students noticed the eerie pattern. Jokingly, they called him 00 Swango, licensed to kill. But the truth was no joke. Wherever Swango went, death followed. During his residency at Ohio State University, alarms grew louder. Patients would suddenly collapse, convulse, or die, often with Swango nearby. Nurses whispered suspicions, but complaints were brushed aside. Hospitals were reluctant to ruin the reputation of a promising young doctor. That reluctance cost lives. Swango's obsession wasn't limited to patients. He targeted colleagues too. In 1984, several co-workers fell violently ill after eating pastries and drinking iced tea he had prepared. Tests revealed arsenic. Police moved in. Swango was convicted of aggravated battery and sentenced to 5 years in prison. For most people, that would have ended their medical career. But not Swango. His charm, lies, and forged documents opened new doors. By the late 1980s, he was out of prison, changing his name, falsifying applications, and securing new jobs in hospitals. Each new workplace was a hunting ground. In South Dakota, patients died suddenly. In New York, at a Veterans Affairs hospital, the pattern intensified. 3 patients were poisoned with fatal doses of toxic substances. Swango kept meticulous diaries, filled with sadistic fantasies and chilling admissions. He wrote of the pleasure he felt, the godlike power of holding life and death in his hands. Colleagues grew suspicious, but the system failed again and again. Hospitals quietly dismissed him rather than confront the nightmare. Instead of warnings, they offered silence, allowing him to move on and kill again. His crimes eventually stretched beyond U.S. borders. In the mid-1990s, he fled to Zimbabwe, finding work at a mission hospital. Patients there, too, began dying mysteriously. But Swango's luck was running out. In 1997, he attempted to flee to Saudi Arabia for another medical job. The FBI intercepted him at O'Hare International Airport. In his possession were syringes, poisons, and his dark writings. He was arrested, finally stopped after years of death trailing his every move. In 2000, facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Michael Swango struck a deal. He pleaded guilty to murdering 3 patients and admitted to a 4th. Prosecutors, however, believe the true number is far higher, perhaps 60 lives cut short by his hand. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without parole. Today, he sits in the ADX Florence Supermax prison, a facility reserved for the most dangerous criminals in America. Christopher Dunch. He came with a scalpel and a smile. Patients called him brilliant, charismatic, even gifted. His resume boasted prestigious training, groundbreaking potential, and the air of a man destined for greatness in the operating room. But what followed was not healing, it was carnage. And his name, Christopher Dunch, would become synonymous with betrayal, malpractice, and murder by another name. In the early 2010s, Dunch carved a path of destruction across Dallas, Texas. He was a neurosurgeon, entrusted with the fragile architecture of the human spine. But in his hands, surgery became an executioner's tool. 38 patients lay under his knife. 33 emerged broken, paralyzed, crippled, or in ceaseless agony. 2 never walked out at all. His mistakes weren't simple lapses of skill. They were horrors, arteries slashed open, screws drilled into muscle instead of bone, spines butchered beyond repair. One victim, Kelly Martin, bled to death after a so-called routine procedure. Another, Floella Brown, suffered a massive stroke when Dunch severed her vertebral artery. Mary Efford, an elderly woman, was left permanently paralyzed after he shredded her spinal column. And perhaps the most devastating betrayal of all, his own childhood friend, Jerry Summers, entered surgery with confidence and left as a quadriplegic. Doctors who reviewed his work were stunned. They said his surgeries looked less like accidents and more like deliberate mutilations. One surgeon described his handiwork as resembling a violent assault. Another said, "He had to know how to do it right, and yet he did the exact opposite." Was he incompetent or malicious? The truth may lie in an email he sent in 2011, dripping with menace. "I am ready to leave the love and kindness and goodness and become a cold-blooded killer." It was more than a boast. It was a confession of intent. What makes the Dunch case especially chilling is not just the scale of his damage, but how long it was allowed to continue. Hospitals passed him along like a poisoned chalice, quietly letting him resign rather than reporting him to federal oversight databases. Each resignation was a death sentence for his next patient. This practice, known as passing the trash, shielded him while innocence paid the price. It might have continued indefinitely had it not been for 2 men, Dr. Robert Henderson and Dr. Randall Kirby. They watched Dunch's devastation firsthand and refused to remain silent. They documented every shattered patient, every surgical massacre, and they brought their evidence to the Texas Medical Board. They demanded action. Finally, in 2013, Dunch's medical license was revoked. But Henderson and Kirby didn't stop there. They pressed prosecutors, arguing that this was more than negligence. This was crime. And in 2015, Dunch was arrested. His trial was historic. The first time in American history a surgeon was criminally charged for the harm he caused inside the operating room. The prosecution zeroed in on one victim, Mary Efford, charging him with intentionally causing serious bodily injury to an elderly person. The defense claimed he was merely incompetent, but the jury heard his email. They saw the staggering consistency of his destruction. And in February 2017, they returned a verdict of guilty. Christopher Dunch, Dr. Death, was sentenced to life in prison. Today, he sits behind bars, his career in ruins, his legacy one of broken bodies and betrayed trust. His case set a precedent that the white coat does not grant immunity, that a scalpel in the wrong hands can be a weapon as deadly as a gun. Dr. Anthony Garcia, the revenge killer. If Petiot's crimes were fueled by greed, the case of Dr. Anthony Joseph Garcia revealed another form of evil. Revenge nurtured for years, sharpened until it cut into flesh. Born in 1973, Garcia was a man who dreamed of a brilliant medical career, but could not control his own arrogance. Colleagues described him as belligerent, erratic, incapable of humility. His failure culminated in 2001 when he was dismissed from the pathology residency program at Creighton University Medical Center in Omaha, Nebraska. The termination letter bore the signature of Dr. Roger Brumbach, the department chair. Other faculty, including Dr. William Hunter and Dr. Chandra Butra, had supported the decision. For most, it was a professional setback. For Garcia, it became an obsession. 7 years later, that obsession turned lethal. On March 13, 2008, in a quiet Omaha neighborhood, Dr. Hunter's home stood empty, except for his 11-year-old son, Thomas Hunter, and the family's housekeeper, Shirley Sherman. Garcia entered with a knife taken from the kitchen. What followed was a frenzy of rage. Thomas, only a child, was stabbed to death. Shirley, a 57-year-old caretaker, met the same fate. Blood pooled across the floor in a crime that investigators described as ferocious. The Hunters were shattered. A brilliant young boy's life extinguished. A family left in ruins. All because his father had once signed a document. For 5 years, the murders went unsolved. Police had only a vague sketch of a man driving a silver Honda CR-V, but no name to match it. The case grew cold. Garcia went on with his failed attempts at medical practice, moving between states, unable to keep steady work. But his resentment never cooled. In May 2013, he struck again. First, he attempted to break into the home of Dr. Butra, another faculty member tied to his dismissal. The alarm drove him away. Minutes later, Garcia drove to the home of Dr. Roger Brumbach, the man whose signature had ended his residency 12 years earlier. Inside, Garcia unleashed his vengeance. He stabbed Dr. Brumbach and then shot him. His wife, Mary Brumbach, was also stabbed repeatedly, killed in her own kitchen. The crime was brutal, personal, and deliberate. This time, investigators made the connection. 2 double murders, 5 years apart, both targeting families of Creighton faculty, both involving kitchen knives, both tied to Garcia's past. Detectives reviewed the list of dismissed residents. One name stood out. The evidence tightened around him. Garcia owned a silver Honda CR-V, matching witness descriptions from 2008. He had recently purchased a firearm identical to one used in the Brumbach murders. His credit card records placed him in Omaha at the time of the killings. Cell phone data showed a chilling sequence. A search for the Brumbach address immediately after the failed break-in at Dr. Butra's home. Garcia had not simply snapped, he had plotted. In July 2013, police arrested him during a traffic stop in Illinois. His arrogance had carried him this far, but the net was closing. The trial in October 2016 revealed the depth of his hatred. Jurors saw the link between a man who could not accept failure and the families who bore the cost of his vengeance. Garcia sat silent, expressionless, as witnesses described the carnage. Photos of the child, Thomas Hunter, became the centerpiece of the prosecution. He was only 11, an innocent used as a weapon to strike at his father's heart. In 2016, Anthony Garcia was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. 2 years later, in September 2018, a 3-judge panel sentenced him to death. The courtroom fell into silence as the ruling was read. Garcia's story is not one of greed like Petiot's, nor of compulsive killing like Shipman's. It is the story of a man so consumed by resentment that he murdered children to wound their fathers. Revenge became his identity. Medicine was only the stage upon which his ego collapsed, and in that collapse, 4 lives were stolen. Dr. H. Holmes, The Murder Castle, Chicago, 1893. The city buzzed with the spectacle of the World's Fair, millions of visitors drawn by dazzling lights, exotic exhibits, and the promise of progress. But just a few miles away, hidden in plain sight, stood a building that was anything but progress. It was a structure designed not for comfort, but for death. A labyrinth of fear, crafted by a man the world would come to know as Dr. H. Holmes, the nation's first truly industrial-scale killer. Holmes was a physician, a charmer, a businessman, but beneath the polished exterior lived Herman Webster Mudgett, a man consumed not by healing, but by greed, sadism, and control. He lured women with promises of jobs, shelter, or marriage. What they found was a prison disguised as a hotel. The 3-story structure on the corner of Wallace and 63rd became infamous as the Murder Castle. A maze of over 100 windowless rooms, secret stairways, trap doors, and passages that led nowhere. Some rooms were fitted with hidden gas lines. Holmes could watch as his victims clawed for air before collapsing. Other chambers were soundproof, designed to contain the screams. A single glance at the blueprints revealed something chilling. This was not architecture for commerce. It was architecture for slaughter. Holmes's basement was his laboratory of horror. Here, bodies disappeared. Some were stretched on racks, others reduced to ashes in a furnace big enough to cremate a grown man. Acid pits swallowed what remained. For the bodies left intact, Holmes had a lucrative side business, stripping the flesh and selling skeletons to medical schools eager for specimens. Each corpse became profit. Every life extinguished became cash in his pocket. The timing was perfect for his plan. The World's Fair filled Chicago with naive travelers and hopeful job seekers. Many checked into Holmes's hotel and never checked out. He confessed to 27 murders, but investigators believed the real toll stretched into the hundreds. The castle was a conveyor belt of death. Holmes thrived in the shadows until greed pushed him into the light. His downfall came not from the castle, but from an insurance scam. With his associate Benjamin Petiot, Holmes hatched a scheme to fake Petitzel's death and collect on the policy. But Holmes, ever the predator, killed Petitzel outright. Not content with one victim, he murdered 3 of Petitzel's children, burning one alive in a trunk, suffocating another, and burying them in shallow graves. The brutality was staggering, and it was sloppy. A disgruntled prison cellmate tipped off police after Holmes failed to pay him his cut. Investigators began to track Holmes's movements, piecing together a pattern of vanished victims. When authorities finally searched the castle, they uncovered the true extent of the nightmare: secret chambers, instruments of torture, and charred remains. Newspaper headlines exploded. America had never seen a killer like this. Holmes stood trial for the murder of Benjamin Petiot. The jury deliberated for only minutes. Guilty. On May 7, 1896, Dr. H. Holmes was executed by hanging in Philadelphia. True to his calculating nature, he requested that his coffin be encased in cement and buried 10 feet deep, fearing grave robbers would dissect his body as he had dissected so many others. His death ended the man, but not the legend. The murder castle was torn down, but its memory lingered as a warning of what happens when intelligence and power are twisted into pure malevolence. Holmes had hidden his sadism behind a doctor's title and a businessman's charm. He had turned progress into a trap, a World's Fair into a hunting ground. And to this day, the exact number of victims remains unknown. lost forever in the dark corridors of his castle. Dr. Jayant Patel, the surgeon who played God by negligence. Queensland, Australia, 2003. Into Bundaberg Base Hospital walked a man whose resume seemed polished, whose credentials seemed solid. His name was Dr. Jayant Patel. Indian-born, trained in the United States, appointed director of surgery, a figure of authority, a figure of trust. But behind the crisp shirt and polished glasses lay a trail of disciplinary warnings. In New York and Oregon, Patel's incompetence had already been flagged. Hospitals had restricted his practice, citing negligence and misconduct. Yet here he was, thousands of miles away, reinvented, thanks to lies on paper and a system eager to fill gaps with overseas-trained doctors. The hospital thought it had found a savior. Instead, it had unleashed a butcher. Between 2003 and 2005, Patel performed surgery after surgery, his name whispered with dread by nurses and junior staff. His methods were described as sloppy, antiquated, even reckless. Patients who should have lived never came home. Patients who entered the operating theater for hope walked out in coffins. Consider Ian Vowles, subjected to a grotesque mutilation when Patel removed his healthy bowel. Darcy Blight, left to suffer after Patel failed to remove a cancerous tumor. Gerardus Kemps bled internally while Patel stood by, doing nothing. Soon, whispers turned to panic. Nurses began hiding their patients from him, deliberately rerouting cases, terrified that Patel's hands would be the last thing their patients ever felt. One nurse, Toni Hoffman, watched in horror as the death toll mounted. She became a whistleblower, documenting Patel's carnage, sounding alarms that were too often ignored. By 2005, the scale of disaster could no longer be concealed. Patel had been linked to at least 87 deaths. In Bundaberg, the community seethed with rage. This was no healer. This was a fraud, a charlatan cloaked in surgical green, leaving a trail of corpses in his wake. When the media finally exposed him, Patel vanished, fleeing back to Portland, Oregon. But the families of Bundaberg would not forget, nor would Toni Hoffman. Their voices sparked a public inquiry, a firestorm of outrage that forced the government to act. Extradition followed. In 2010, Patel stood trial in Queensland. The verdict, guilty on 3 counts of manslaughter, 1 of grievous bodily harm. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. But justice, it seemed, was not so simple. In 2012, Australia's High Court quashed the convictions, ruling that the jury had been unfairly swayed by prejudicial evidence about his general incompetence rather than the specific charges. One manslaughter retrial ended in acquittal. Finally, in 2013, the prosecution struck a deal. Patel pleaded guilty not to murder, but to fraud, for lying to obtain his medical license and his job. For this, he received a suspended 2-year sentence and a lifetime ban from practicing medicine in Australia. For the families of Bundaberg, the verdict was a second wound. Their loved ones were gone, their lives destroyed, and the man who held the scalpel walked free after serving little time. Patel's story is not one of sadism or thrill-killing. It is the story of a man whose arrogance and deception turned the sacred act of healing into slaughter. A story of a system that failed, and a reminder that sometimes evil does not snarl with intent, but smiles through incompetence and lies. Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death. If Petrov represents the corruption of one man's medical duty, Josef Mengele embodies something darker, the merging of medicine with ideology, where healing became torture and science became genocide. His name is etched into history with a single damning title, the Angel of Death. Born in 1911 in Günzburg, Germany, Mengele was the son of a prosperous Bavarian family. Intelligent and ambitious, he pursued medicine and anthropology, eventually joining the Nazi Party and the SS. His loyalty to Hitler's ideology and his fascination with racial theory led him to Auschwitz in 1943. At Auschwitz, the largest of the Nazi death camps, trains arrived daily, crammed with Jewish families, Roma, prisoners of war, and political captives. As the doors opened, chaos spilled onto the platform. Screaming children, exhausted mothers, skeletal men, all shoved forward into the glare of floodlights. And there stood Mengele, immaculate in his SS uniform, gloved hand raised, flicking his wrist left or right. One gesture meant temporary survival in forced labor. The other meant immediate death in the gas chambers. Life or death decided in seconds, with no more weight to him than the turn of a page. But selections were only the beginning. Mengele's obsession lay in experimentation. He targeted twins, dwarfs, and those with unusual physical features. To him, they were not human beings. They were raw material for his research. Prisoners spoke of his charm, his almost theatrical demeanor. Children called him Uncle Mengele when he greeted them with sweets. But once inside his laboratory, the mask dropped. His experiments were sadistic beyond comprehension. He injected diseases and chemicals into children, deliberately infecting them with typhus or tuberculosis. He performed surgeries without anesthesia, amputating limbs or stitching organs together. He tried to change eye color by injecting dye directly into the iris, leaving children screaming in blindness. He exposed prisoners to freezing water until their hearts stopped, attempting to study hypothermia. He ordered pregnant women dissected alive to study fetal development. Survivors recalled his cold fascination, as though their agony was nothing but data. For him, there was no subject too cruel, no experiment too inhumane. The number of victims is beyond measure. Mengele personally condemned thousands to the gas chambers during selections. Thousands more perished under his research. He confessed to nothing, left no records that fully captured the scale. But survivor testimony leaves no doubt. His cruelty was limitless. His motives were a toxic fusion of Nazi ideology and personal sadism. To the Reich, his work was framed as research into Aryan superiority. To Mengele himself, it was also gratification. Survivors described the gleam in his eye, the smile as he wielded absolute control over life and death. Unlike Petrov, who killed for robbery, Mengele killed because he could. When the Red Army liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, Mengele fled. Unlike many SS doctors tried at Nuremberg, he slipped through the cracks. With forged papers and help from Nazi sympathizers, he escaped to South America. For decades, he lived under false names in Argentina, Paraguay, and finally Brazil. Nazi hunters searched, Mossad agents pursued, but the Angel of Death was always one step ahead. He worked on farms, wrote in notebooks, and lived quietly, far from the justice his victims deserved. In 1979, Josef Mengele suffered a stroke while swimming off the coast of Brazil. He drowned, his body buried under another name. Only in 1985 did forensic analysis confirm his identity. He had escaped trial, punishment, and accountability. To survivors, The injustice was a wound that never healed. The man who had sent thousands to death with a flick of his hand, who had mutilated children under the guise of medicine, had lived freely into old age. Joseph Mengele remains the darkest symbol of medicine's betrayal, the doctor who made Auschwitz his laboratory, the physician who became executioner. He did not wear the mask of healer to rob or to cover petty crime. He wore it to annihilate, to torture, to bend science itself into the service of death. Dr. Marcel Petiot, Dr. Satan of Paris. The story of Dr. Marcel André-Henri Félix. Petiot is one of horror disguised in the white coat of a physician. Born in 1897 in Auxerre, France, Petiot was a troubled boy, brilliant but volatile. Even in his youth, his teachers and peers saw flashes of darkness. He was expelled multiple times for disruptive behavior, and whispers of cruelty followed him into adulthood. Yet he clawed his way into medical school, earned a degree, and eventually opened a practice. To patients, he seemed eccentric but competent. Behind closed doors, he was a man with a taste for manipulation, cruelty, and money. When the Nazis occupied France during the Second World War, Petiot found his greatest opportunity. Paris was a city suffocated by fear. The Gestapo hunted Jews, resistance fighters, and anyone suspected of disloyalty to the Reich. Desperate families clutched at any chance of escape, and Petiot was waiting for them. Operating under the alias Doctor Eugène, he spun a deadly lie. For a fee of 25,000 francs, he claimed he could smuggle men, women, and children to freedom in South America. He assured his victims that through secret contacts, safe routes, and forged documents, they would find new lives far from persecution. Many believed him because he was a doctor, because he carried himself with authority, because hope made them blind. His townhouse at 21 Rue Le Sieur became the last stop for dozens, perhaps hundreds. Families arrived with suitcases of valuables, gold, cash, jewelry, everything they owned. Petiot would greet them warmly, explain that before departure they needed inoculations to meet foreign health requirements, and then lead them to a private room. There, instead of a vaccine, he injected them with a lethal dose of cyanide. Death was swift, but the deception was infinite cruelty. They came believing they would board ships to freedom. Instead, they collapsed on his floors. Disposal was systematic. At first, Petiot dumped bodies into the Seine, but as the murders multiplied, he shifted to more efficient methods. He used quicklime pits in his backyard and even a roaring coal stove in his basement. Witnesses later recalled the stench that hung over the Rue Le Sieur, the acrid smoke, the greasy soot, the smell of burning flesh disguised as winter fuel. His home was not a clinic. It was a crematory. Petiot grew rich. Investigators later estimated he amassed 200 million francs in cash and valuables, the life savings of those who trusted him. But greed alone cannot explain the meticulous sadism of his crimes. The elaborate ruse, the injections, the incineration. It suggested something darker. A man who relished absolute control over life and death. The facade unraveled on March 11, 1944. Neighbors, sickened by foul smoke and thick, oily clouds pouring from Petiot's chimney, called authorities. Firemen entered and discovered a nightmare. In the basement, human remains burned in the coal stove. In other rooms, they found heaps of dismembered body parts, quicklime pits, and bags stuffed with flesh. 72 suitcases filled with clothing and personal belongings, testified to the scale of his slaughter. Paris police recoiled in horror, but Petiot was not caught. Slipping into the chaos of the city, he reinvented himself once again, this time as a patriot. He joined the French forces of the interior, the resistance group that had sworn to hunt collaborators. Wearing their uniform, he even rose to the rank of captain, walking openly through liberated streets while police hunted Dr. Eugène. His arrogance ended in October 1944, when he was recognized and arrested in a Paris metro station. At trial, Petiot spun a final grotesque defense. He claimed his victims were not innocent Jews or resistance hopefuls, but Nazi collaborators and double agents. He painted himself as a hero who lured traitors to their deaths. The court did not believe him. His own meticulous bookkeeping, the mountains of stolen property, and the testimonies of grieving families exposed the truth. On May 25, 1946, Marcel Petiot was led to the guillotine. At dawn, Dr. Satan lost the very control he had inflicted on so many others. He had been convicted of 26 murders, though investigators believed the real toll was closer to 200. As the blade fell, Paris exhaled. But the question remained: how could a physician, a man entrusted with healing, become a predator who turned medicine into a mask for industrial murder? For Petiot, the Hippocratic Oath was not a promise. It was camouflage. Dr. Maxim Petrov, Dr. Death of St. Petersburg. In the icy streets of St. Petersburg, Russia, fear once hid in the unlikeliest of forms, not a shadowy criminal in a back alley, but a man in a white coat. Maxim Vladimirovich Petrov, born in 1965, was a physician, an emergency doctor whose patients trusted him to heal. But behind his soft-spoken demeanor lay a predator who would come to be known by a name that chilled Russians to the bone: Dr. Death. Petrov's descent began not with murder, but with theft. By the mid-1990s, his medical career was faltering, his finances strained. In 1997, he began exploiting the ultimate symbol of trust in Russia: house calls from a doctor. Carrying his medical bag, wearing his white coat, he arrived unannounced at the homes of his elderly patients, many of them frail, many of them alone. He presented his visits as routine checkups. With practiced ease, he would take their blood pressure, chat softly, reassure them. Then came the betrayal. He drew up an injection, claiming it was harmless medication, an anesthetic, he said. Once the needle pierced their skin, the drug coursed through their veins, and within minutes, the patient slipped into unconsciousness. While they lay incapacitated, Petrov rifled through drawers, closets, and purses, stripping the victims of cash, jewelry, and small valuables. At first, his crimes left bodies alive, but dignity shattered. He was a thief, not yet a killer. That changed on February 2nd, 1999. During his 30th robbery, fate shifted the game. Petrov had drugged an elderly patient when the woman's daughter unexpectedly returned home. Caught in the act, panic surged. Petrov grabbed a screwdriver, plunging it into her body, silencing her screams. Then he turned back to the unconscious patient, wrapping his hands around her throat until her chest no longer rose. That day, the thief became a murderer. From then on, there would be no survivors. Petrov refined his methods. No longer did he leave his victims breathing. He began preparing lethal cocktails of drugs, anesthetic mixed with poison. Patients slumped in their chairs, thinking they were being treated, unaware they were being dispatched to death. After looting their apartments, He set fires to erase evidence, leaving behind charred ruins and confusion. Death by doctor became a spreading plague across St. Petersburg's elderly population. The city was terrified. Doors that once opened readily to a trusted physician now stayed locked. Whispers spread. A doctor was killing his own patients. Yet investigators had no clear suspect. The crimes seemed random, the fires erasing crucial evidence. Petrov was clever, using his profession as both disguise and weapon. The breakthrough came from a pattern invisible at first glance. Detectives discovered that every victim was a patient from the same clinic, all recently listed for lung X-ray examinations. The killer, they realized, was working from a medical list, choosing victims with precision. The operation to catch him was codenamed Medbrat, male nurse. Police compiled a list of 72 potential future targets from the same medical records. 700 officers were deployed in shifts to watch over them. Day and night, detectives hid in stairwells, sat in unmarked cars, waited for the predator to appear. On January 17, 2000, the trap closed. Petrov, wearing his doctor's coat, carrying his bag, arrived at the home of one of the listed patients. He rang the bell, unsuspecting. Inside, police officers waited. He was arrested on the spot. A search of his flat revealed damning evidence: jewelry, cash, and possessions belonging to the murdered elderly. Petrov initially confessed to multiple murders, then retracted, claiming he had been pressured. But the evidence spoke louder than his denial. In 2002, a Russian court convicted him of 11 murders, though he had been tried for 17 and suspected of as many as 19. The verdict: life in prison. To this day, Russia remembers Maxim Petrov not for his medical service, but for the grotesque betrayal of his oath. Doctors promised to do no harm. Petrov turned that oath inside out, weaponizing it, preying on the weak, extinguishing lives with the very tools meant to preserve them. He was not Dr. Death in name alone. For nearly 3 years, he became a symbol of ultimate betrayal. The healer who killed. Dr. Morris Bolber, the doctor who joined a murder ring. Philadelphia, 1930s, a city of immigrants, factories, and shadows. In these shadows, a sinister ring thrived, a conspiracy where life insurance policies became death warrants. At the heart of it was a cast of unlikely killers, gang members, fraudsters, and a woman whispered about with fear as the Philadelphia Witch. Together they wove a network of deceit that preyed on the poor and desperate. Their scheme was brutally simple: convince struggling Italian immigrants to take out multiple life insurance policies, then kill them and collect. But scams and bludgeonings only worked so long. For the enterprise to thrive, the gang needed something more. They needed science. They needed someone who could turn murder into medicine. Enter Dr. Morris Bolber. A physician, respected on the surface, Bolber lent the gang not only legitimacy, but lethal knowledge. His expertise transformed crude killings into deaths that looked natural, clever enough to fool coroners, insurers, and the law. At first, the gang staged accidents, but under Bolber's guidance, the methods grew colder, subtler, more efficient. One technique was especially chilling: striking victims at the base of the skull with a sand-filled bag. The blow caused a cerebral hemorrhage, a fatal brain bleed that left no outward trace. Bolber would then sign the death certificate, nodding solemnly as if fate itself had struck. This was murder as business, a conveyor belt of corpses, each insured, each claimed, each profit split among conspirators. The ring is believed to have killed at least 30 people. The victims were not chosen out of hatred or vengeance. They were chosen because they were vulnerable, because they were worth more dead than alive. Every certificate Bolber signed was a mask of legitimacy over calculated homicide. Eventually, the ring's greed caught up with them. Investigators began to connect the dots, the insurance claims, the suspicious deaths, the names that kept surfacing in policy ledgers. The gang that thought itself invisible was finally unmasked. And Dr. Bolber? His role was undeniable. He had turned his medical oath inside out, twisting healing into homicide, becoming the scientific backbone of a machine built to harvest human lives for cash. Though his exact sentencing record is obscured by time, history remembers him as one of the darkest figures in American medical crime, the doctor who gave professional expertise to professional killers. His story is less about a lone predator and more about a chilling reminder. When knowledge falls into the wrong hands, entire systems of death can be built. Dr. William Palmer, the Prince of Poisoners, England, mid-19th century. A small town in Staffordshire was about to make history, not for medicine, not for discovery, but for murder. At the center stood Dr. William Palmer, a man the press would immortalize as the Prince of Poisoners. Palmer was charming, well-educated, and trusted, but beneath the veneer of a respectable country doctor was a compulsive gambler drowning in debt. And where most men might beg or borrow, Palmer found another solution: murder. He began with those closest to him, his infant children, 4 of them dead before their first birthdays. His wife, Anne, insured for thousands of pounds, dead in her 20s. His brother Walter, also insured, gone within months. Death seemed to follow Palmer like a shadow, but each time the good doctor was conveniently present. Each time, insurance money padded his wallet. The weapon of choice: poison. Strychnine and antimony, substances that twisted the human body into contorted spasms, violent convulsions that mimicked natural conditions like tetanus. In an age when forensic science was still primitive, Palmer exploited the gap between symptom and science, hiding murder behind the mask of medicine. But greed eventually outpaced subtlety. In 1855, Palmer's friend and fellow horse racing enthusiast, John Parsons Cook, struck it rich, winning thousands at the Shrewsbury races. Palmer, deep in gambling losses, saw his opportunity. Over celebratory drinks, Cook complained that his gin burned his throat. Over the next several days, his agony worsened: seizures, spasms, convulsions. Palmer hovered at his bedside, prescribing medicine. In truth, each dose pushed Cook closer to death. Witnesses described Cook's final hours as pure torment, his body locked in agony, jaw clenched, limbs arching violently, until at last he lay still. Palmer signed the death as natural, but Cook's stepfather wasn't convinced. He demanded an autopsy. At the post-mortem, Palmer's guilt began to show. He jostled the doctors performing the examination, spilling crucial stomach contents onto the ground. He tried to bribe the delivery boy tasked with carrying the remains to the chemist for analysis. Every move reeked of desperation. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational of Victorian England. So notorious was Palmer that Parliament itself intervened, moving the case from Staffordshire to the Old Bailey in London to ensure fairness. Crowds of thousands swarmed the proceedings. Forensic toxicology was in its infancy, but it took center stage. Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor, one of the era's foremost toxicologists, testified that strychnine was nearly impossible to detect chemically after death, but Cook's symptoms were unmistakable. His convulsions were too violent, too characteristic to be mistaken. A chemist's assistant sealed Palmer's fate, testifying that he had sold Palmer strychnine just days before the death. The defense protested the lack of direct chemical proof, but the jury saw the truth. Cook had been poisoned, and Palmer was the hand behind it. On June 14, 1856, William Palmer was hanged before a crowd of 30,000 spectators. His death was a public spectacle, a chilling example of justice served, but his crimes left scars deeper than the gallows. His case marked a turning point in the fight against poisoners, spurring advancements in forensic science and toxicology. Palmer's story is one of betrayal. A doctor sworn to heal turned predator, slaughtering those closest to him for money. His hands, trained to heal, mixed poison instead. His mind, educated in medicine, twisted into schemes of fraud and death. He was not just a gambler losing at the track. He was a gambler with lives, and the stakes were human souls. Fredrick Pechier. Across the ocean, in France, another doctor stands accused, not in the past tense, but right now. His name is Fredrick Pechier, and in September 2025, his trial unfolds in a packed Besançon courtroom, with families of the dead staring at the man they believe murdered their loved ones. Unlike Dunch, Pechier wasn't accused of butchering patients through incompetence. No, his alleged crimes are far stranger, more sinister. He was a star anesthesiologist, respected, admired, the kind of man who seemed to save lives with theatrical flair. But prosecutors claim he didn't wait for emergencies. He created them. Between 2008 and 2017, Pechier is accused of poisoning as many as 30 patients, 12 fatally. His suspected method was chillingly precise, tampering with IV bags or anesthesia pouches, spiking them with lethal doses of drugs like lidocaine or potassium chloride. These otherwise healthy, low-risk patients would suddenly collapse on the operating table, their hearts seizing into cardiac arrest. And then, like a hero swooping in, Pechier would be the first to diagnose poisoning, the first to resuscitate, basking in the glow of admiration. The prosecution calls it a hero complex, a deadly craving for recognition. Some even believe he engineered crises not just to play savior, but to humiliate colleagues by making them appear incompetent until he stepped forward with the cure. The victims span generations. A 4-year-old boy named Teddy, who survived 2 cardiac arrests during a simple tonsillectomy. To elderly patients whose routine surgeries turned to funerals. Their families were left with the same gnawing questions. Why? How could an anesthesiologist, the guardian of life during surgery, become the orchestrator of near death? Investigators began connecting the dots in 2017 after clusters of inexplicable arrests were linked by a common denominator: Pechier's presence. More chilling still, the crises tended to erupt during moments of workplace conflict, as though engineered for maximum theatrical effect. Unlike the silent confidence of Dunch, Pechier's alleged weapon was subtlety. A few milliliters of liquid slipped into a syringe or IV bag, invisible until the body collapsed, and then applause for the doctor who saved the day. But now, in court, the applause has fallen silent. Families sit stone-faced as the prosecution unveils case after case, painting Pechier as a manipulator of life and death. His defense insists he is innocent, that he is being scapegoated, that coincidences are being twisted into a narrative of murder. He sits in the dock, calm, composed, denying every charge. Yet the weight of the evidence looms. If convicted, Pechier faces life in prison, a fate befitting the trust betrayed. But unlike Dunch, his story is not yet finished. Each day, as testimony unfolds, the world watches. The outcome remains uncertain, a live horror still playing out.